There is a question I was asked many times during my years in the Florentine chancery, by men who could not understand why some among them rose to wealth and power while others, often more talented, more educated, more virtuous in the conventional sense, remained exactly where they began. Why do some men accumulate and others do not? The easy answer, the answer that comforts the man who has not risen, is that the world is unjust. That wealth flows to the corrupt, the lucky, the well-born. That the poor remain poor because the game is rigged against them. There is truth in this. I will not pretend otherwise. Fortune plays a real role, and the man born into the right family in the right city at the right moment carries an advantage that no effort can fully replicate from a worse starting position. But I spent 14 years watching men with worse starting positions overtake men with better ones. I watched merchants of obscure birth become wealthier than nobility. I watched princes inherit fortunes and lose them within a decade through a specific set of errors that I came to recognize with total consistency. The world is not entirely fair. But within the unfairness there are patterns. Laws almost governing why some men accumulate and others do not. And those laws apply regardless of where a man begins. My name is Niccolò Machiavelli. Today we examine why most people stay poor, not through bad luck alone, but through a specific set of psychological and strategic errors that I observed across decades of watching men pursue wealth and power in Renaissance Florence. And we examine what the men who escaped poverty, who built genuine and lasting wealth, understood that the others did not. The first law is this: poverty is rarely a condition. It is usually a set of habits operating beneath conscious awareness. I observed this most clearly among the lesser merchants of Florence, men who worked as hard as the wealthy merchants, who were not lacking in intelligence or diligence, and who nonetheless remained at the same modest level for their entire careers while others around them grew significantly wealthier. The difference, when I studied it closely, was rarely effort. It was orientation. The man who remains poor orients himself toward safety, toward the avoidance of loss, toward the preservation of what little he has rather than the calculated risk of what he might gain. He makes decisions designed primarily to ensure that he does not lose ground, and in doing so, he forfeits the decisions that would have allowed him to gain it. This is not stupidity. It is a rational response to scarcity. The man who has little cannot afford to lose what little he has, and so he protects it with a vigilance that, while understandable, also prevents him from ever deploying it toward something larger. The man who accumulates wealth has made a different calculation, consciously or not. He has decided that the risk of loss is acceptable because the alternative, permanent stagnation, is a worse outcome than the risk itself. I observed this distinction in how different merchants responded to opportunity. When a new trade route opened, when a new market became accessible, when a genuine opportunity for expansion presented itself, the cautious merchant calculated what he might lose if it failed. The ambitious merchant calculated what he would forfeit if he did not attempt it. These are not the same calculation, and they produce entirely different lives. The second law is this: most men confuse activity with progress, and this confusion is one of the most reliable mechanisms by which capable people remain poor. I watched men work extraordinarily hard their entire lives without ever accumulating wealth. They were not lazy. They were busy from morning until night. But their labor, however intense, was rarely directed toward the specific actions that produce accumulation. There is a difference between labor that exchanges time for wages and labor that builds an asset. The first produces income that stops the moment the labor stops. The second produces something that continues generating value independent of continued effort. Most men, across my observation, spend their entire working lives in the first category and never transition into the second. Not because they lack the capability, because the transition requires a kind of risk and a kind of delayed gratification that the psychology of scarcity actively works against. The man who is paid daily for daily labor has immediate, certain reward. The man who invests in building an asset, a trade, a piece of land, a network of relationships that will eventually generate returns, sacrifices certain immediate reward for uncertain future reward. This sacrifice is psychologically difficult. It requires tolerating a period in which the labor produces no visible return, sometimes for years, while the asset develops to the point where it begins generating value on its own. Most men cannot tolerate this period, The discomfort of working without immediate visible return is too great, and so they retreat to the certainty of wage labor, trading their time for money indefinitely, never accumulating the asset that would eventually free them from needing to make that trade. This is, in my observation, one of the most reliable mechanisms of permanent poverty. Not lack of effort. Misdirection of effort, away from asset building and toward the immediate, certain, and ultimately limited returns of pure labor. The third law concerns reputation, and it is one that men of modest means consistently misunderstand. I observed across my career that reputation functions as a form of capital, every bit as real as money, and that the men who understood this accumulated wealth far more efficiently than the men who treated reputation as merely a pleasant byproduct of good behavior. A man with a reputation for reliability is extended credit that a man without such reputation is denied. A man with a reputation for competence is offered opportunities that a man without such reputation never encounters. A man with a reputation for discretion is trusted with information that produces advantages unavailable to those who are not trusted. Reputation is not vanity. It is leverage. And the men who remain poor frequently fail to understand this, treating their reputation as a private matter rather than as a public asset to be deliberately cultivated. I watched merchants destroy decades of accumulated reputation through a single act of dishonesty that seemed, in the moment, to offer a small and contained advantage. They did not understand that they were not merely risking a single transaction. They were liquidating an asset that had taken years to build and that, once destroyed, could not be easily rebuilt. The men who accumulated genuine and lasting wealth understood reputation differently. They protected it with a vigilance that sometimes seemed, to outside observers, excessive. They declined transactions that would have been immediately profitable but reputationally costly. They absorbed short-term losses to preserve their standing in situations where their standing was at risk. This was not virtue for its own sake. It was strategic recognition that reputation, properly maintained, compounds. Each transaction conducted with integrity adds to a reservoir of trust that eventually allows for transactions, alliances, and opportunities that would never be available to a man without that reservoir. The poor man, focused on the immediate transaction, frequently fails to see this. The wealthy man, focused on the decades-long arc of his reputation, almost always does. The fourth law is perhaps the most uncomfortable to state plainly, but I observed it with too much consistency to omit it. Most men remain poor because they are unwilling to make decisions that other people will judge them for. Wealth accumulation, in my observation, frequently requires decisions that are socially uncomfortable. Declining to spend money that everyone around you is spending. Living more modestly than your actual means would allow, in order to direct the difference toward accumulation rather than consumption. Making investments that others consider strange or excessively risky. Working in domains that carry less social prestige than the alternatives but offer greater financial opportunity. The man who is highly sensitive to social judgment, who needs the approval and comprehension of those around him, finds these decisions extraordinarily difficult to make. He spends in line with social expectation rather than financial strategy. He pursues prestigious but poorly compensated paths because the alternative would require explaining an unconventional choice to people who would not understand it. I observed this in the contrast between men of noble birth, who frequently maintained appearances they could not genuinely afford because the social cost of appearing diminished was greater than the financial cost of the debt they accumulated to maintain those appearances, and men of more modest birth who had no reputation to protect and were therefore free to make decisions purely on financial logic, unburdened by social expectation. This is one of the genuine inversions of fortune that I observed across my career. The man with less social standing to protect frequently had more freedom to make the financially correct decision. The man with significant social standing was frequently trapped by the need to maintain appearances that consumed the very resources that might otherwise have been accumulated. The lesson here is not to abandon all social consideration. It is to recognize when social consideration is costing you the very accumulation you are pursuing, and to develop the capacity to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood when the misunderstanding is the price of a financially sound decision. The fifth law concerns time, and it is the one I find most men understand intellectually while almost none of them genuinely internalize. Wealth accumulates according to a logic that is profoundly counterintuitive to human psychology. The early years of any accumulation strategy produce results that appear disproportionately small relative to the effort invested. The later years produce results that appear disproportionately large relative to the effort invested. This is the nature of compounding, whether the compounding is financial, reputational, or relational. Early effort produces a small base. That base, given sufficient time, generates returns on itself, and those returns generate further returns, until the accumulated effect of years of patient effort produces an outcome that the early years gave almost no visible indication of. Most men cannot tolerate the early years. The visible return on their effort is so modest relative to the effort invested, that they conclude the strategy is not working and abandon it in favor of something that promises faster results. This is one of the most consistent patterns I observed among men who remained poor despite genuine capability and genuine effort. They began strategies that would have eventually produced real accumulation, but abandoned them during the early low-return years, in favor of new strategies that also required early low-return years that they would also eventually abandon. The man moves from venture to venture, never remaining in any single one long enough for the compounding to begin producing its eventual effect. He is, in effect, perpetually restarting the early years of accumulation, never reaching the later years where the real wealth is generated. The men who genuinely accumulated wealth across my observation were almost without exception men who had identified a strategy, however unglamorous its early returns, and remained committed to it across a period of years sufficient for the compounding to take hold. This requires a particular kind of patience, the same patience I have discussed in other contexts. The discipline to continue building when the building produces no visible result, trusting that the compounding effect, though invisible in the early years, is genuinely operating beneath the surface. The sixth law concerns risk, and it requires careful distinction because it is frequently misunderstood in both directions. I observed two categories of error regarding risk among the men I studied. The first category, the more common one among men who remain poor, is excessive risk aversion. These men decline every opportunity that carries genuine uncertainty, preferring the certain modest outcome to the uncertain larger one, even when the uncertain larger outcome carries genuinely favorable odds. The second category, less common but more dramatic in its consequences, is reckless risk-taking. These men pursue opportunities with insufficient understanding of the actual odds, driven by the fantasy of rapid accumulation rather than the careful calculation of genuine probability, and they frequently lose what little they had in pursuit of outcomes that were never realistically available to them. The men who accumulated genuine wealth navigated between these errors through a specific discipline that I came to recognize as the central skill of successful accumulation. They calculated risk carefully with genuine information rather than hope, and they accepted risks where the calculated odds favored them, even when those odds were not certain, while declining risks where the calculated odds did not favor them, even when the potential reward was attractive. This sounds simple stated plainly. It is extraordinarily difficult to practice, because human psychology is not naturally calibrated to make decisions according to calculated probability. We are drawn toward certainty, even unfavorable certainty, and repelled by uncertainty, even favorable uncertainty. And we are simultaneously drawn toward the fantasy of large uncertain rewards in ways that frequently override accurate calculation of the actual odds. The discipline of accurate risk calculation, separated from both the comfort of false certainty and the seduction of fantastical reward, is rare. And it is, in my observation, one of the most reliable distinguishing characteristics between the men who accumulated genuine wealth and the men who either remained permanently cautious or lost what they had through reckless pursuit of outcomes that were never genuinely available. The seventh law is the one I consider most fundamental, and it underlies everything else I have described today. Most men remain poor because they have not developed an accurate model of how wealth is actually generated, and they continue operating according to a model inherited from their circumstances rather than from genuine observation of how accumulation actually works. The model most men inherit, particularly men born into circumstances of modest means, is that wealth is generated through labor. You work, you are paid, and your wealth is determined by how much you work and how much you are paid for that work. This model is not entirely wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. It describes how income is generated. It does not describe how wealth, which is fundamentally different from income, is actually accumulated. Wealth, properly understood, is generated through ownership of assets that produce value independent of continued labor. Land that generates rent. Trade relationships that generate ongoing commerce. Reputation that generates ongoing opportunity. Knowledge that generates ongoing advantage. Capital that, deployed wisely, generates returns on itself. The man who operates entirely within the labor model never transitions into the ownership model, because the labor model consumes all of his time and energy in the daily production of income, leaving none of the surplus that would be required to begin acquiring the assets that generate wealth independent of his continued labor. The men who escaped this trap, in my observation, were the men who identified, often through difficult and uncomfortable sacrifice, some portion of their labor's output that they could direct toward asset acquisition rather than immediate consumption. They lived below the level their labor would have allowed, directed the difference toward the patient accumulation of assets, and over years and sometimes decades, transitioned from a life dependent entirely on continued labor to a life increasingly supported by the assets they had accumulated. This transition is rarely dramatic. It is rarely visible in any single year. It is the patient, compounding result of years of directing surplus toward ownership rather than consumption, sustained long enough for the compounding to produce its eventual, substantial effect. I want to address the role of fortune directly, because I do not wish to suggest that the laws I have described operate in isolation from the genuine unfairness that exists in any society. Some men are born with access to capital, education, and networks that allow them to begin the process of accumulation from a position that other men, regardless of how diligently they apply every principle I have described, simply do not have access to. This is real. I do not minimize it. But here is what I observed, with enough consistency that I believe it constitutes a genuine law rather than an isolated exception. Men who began from disadvantaged positions and applied the principles I have described, patience, calculated risk, the careful protection of reputation, the deliberate transition from labor to ownership, consistently outperformed men who began from advantaged positions and failed to apply them. Advantage without strategy erodes. I watched it happen repeatedly. The son of a wealthy merchant who inherited capital but never developed the discipline of patient accumulation frequently exhausted that capital within a single generation, sometimes within a single decade, through the same errors I have described: excessive consumption, insufficient patience, reckless or excessively cautious risk-taking, and the failure to protect reputation. Disadvantage with strategy compounds. The man with little who applied genuine discipline, patient accumulation, calculated risk, and careful reputation management, frequently surpassed men who had begun with far greater advantages and squandered them. This is not a claim that fortune does not matter. It is an observation that fortune, whatever advantage or disadvantage it confers at the starting point, is not the only or even the primary determinant of the eventual outcome. Strategy, applied with patience across sufficient time, consistently overcomes the disadvantage of an unfavorable starting position, while the absence of strategy consistently erodes the advantage of a favorable one. I want to close with what I consider the deepest law underlying everything I have described. Wealth, properly understood, is not primarily a financial phenomenon. It is a psychological one. The man who remains poor, in my extensive observation, almost always carries a particular relationship with scarcity that shapes every decision he makes, regardless of his actual financial circumstances at any given moment. He orients toward the avoidance of loss rather than the pursuit of gain. He values immediate certainty over delayed but favorable probability. He spends in proportion to social expectation rather than financial strategy. He cannot tolerate the early low-return years that any genuine accumulation strategy requires. This orientation can exist in a man who has considerable income and will keep him poor despite that income, because the psychology, not the income, is what determines whether accumulation occurs. And the opposite orientation, what I might call an orientation toward genuine ownership and patient compounding, can exist in a man with very little and will, given sufficient time, produce genuine wealth, because the strategy, sustained across years, compounds regardless of how modest its starting point. The most important wealth you can build, before any financial asset, is the psychological capacity I have described across this conversation. The patience to tolerate years without visible return. The discipline to calculate risk accurately rather than according to fear or fantasy. The willingness to be misunderstood when social expectation conflicts with financial strategy. The recognition that reputation is capital and must be protected as carefully as any other asset. And the fundamental shift from a model of wealth as the product of labor to a model of wealth as the product of ownership, patiently accumulated and allowed to compound across sufficient time. I spent my years of exile with almost nothing. The position, the income, the daily access to the political life of Florence that had been the foundation of everything I had built across 14 years of service, all of it was gone. What remained was the accumulated understanding, the years of careful observation, the discipline developed across decades to continue working even when the work produced no visible return. That accumulated understanding became the prints. It became the discourses. It became a body of work that, 500 years later, continues to generate value, continues to be read, continues to be discussed, continues to compound and influence in a way that the modest farm at Sant Andrea in Percasina never could have predicted. This was not financial wealth in the conventional sense, but it followed the exact same laws. Patient accumulation across years that produced no visible return. The transition from labor, the daily writing, to ownership, the body of work that continued generating value long after the labor that produced it had ended. The careful protection of intellectual reputation, even in exile, even with no immediate audience. The laws are the same, whether the domain is gold or ideas or relationships or reputation. Patience, calculated risk, the willingness to be misunderstood, the discipline to build ownership rather than merely exchange labor. Apply them across sufficient time, and the compounding will do what no single decision ever could. Most people stay poor not because the world is entirely unfair, though it sometimes is, but because they have not developed the psychology and the strategy that the laws of accumulation actually require. You now have both. What you do with them is the only thing that was ever within your control. Build accordingly.